one of the threads that you were developing was, we'll do two at the same time. One was that the scientific process in terms of physical reality, maybe in your view, peaked in the 1960s. And then you could imagine that you kind of outlined two maybe reasons for that. One was fear of the apocalyptic consequences of that technology and an escape into various forms of abstraction. So some of those abstractions were psychological abstractions, inner journeys, but some of it also was escape into digital abstraction. And then you also made a case that the avenue for exploration in the digital realm was still open. And so maybe we could understand this. So
and then the digital realm, and then in some ways even these escapes weren't full escapes. So AI, it seems to be just about bits, not atoms, but then if you combine it with a drone, the AI comes back to the physical real world.
Well, we'll get back to that, back to the overlap. But so you could imagine that, so the scientific approach, the method, produced an explosion of technological consequences. Many of them were dramatic in the physical world. There was kickbacks against that. One of the kickbacks was the apocalyptic element. The other was the turn away from spirituality, you might say. But then there was also the counterposition that always develops in any revolution, is that things get tangled up in red tape in weird ways. Like the scientific, I was just in Uzbekistan, and they developed a pretty sophisticated industrial economy in the last 5 years. And part of the reason that they could do that was because there was nothing in the way, right? Because Uzbekistan was kind of devoid of impediments to radical entrepreneurship in the aftermath of the communist default. Now, you could imagine that for a good time, the scientific method was so powerful that it was producing revolutions nonstop, and the legal and bureaucratic frameworks were lagging it. And so they caught up quite remarkably by the 1970s, and that left the digital space still open. And it is kind of a free-for-all space.
Yeah, but the way you're telling the story, it has too much of this timeless and eternal character. This is just what always happens, and progress.
Well, that is what I'm wondering.
So you always, whereas the story I want to tell has more of a one-time and world historical character to it, where it is, there were lots of inventions where people figure out cures for diseases. That didn't say, okay, now we have to take a step back and cure fewer diseases. It actually encourages you to double down on that and do even more. Or we have all these machines that replace humans in factories, and there's some downsides to it, and there are labor problems with the Industrial Revolution, and there's a lot of pollution. But on the whole, the good way outweighs the bad, and there was no big regulatory counter movement in Victorian Britain.
Let me make a counter example.
But then we get to something like thermonuclear weapons, and that specifically has a very different character. It has a really different character. And probably, I don't know, by the 1950s and 1960s, baby boomers get, you're a kid, you get brought up on Dr. Seuss and not on adventure stories. And it probably changes childhood education. It changes the way we form and develop human beings. And so it leads to a society where, science and technology no longer have quite of this former valence.